If you could guarantee a tanda with anyone you wanted, would you pay for it? That's the question at the heart of today's banter. Taxi dancers. For some, it's a lifeline to the tandas that they dream about. In a world where gender imbalance and social codes can make dancing feel very scarce. For others, it's a line crossed, a commercial transaction in a space that we like to think of as free and spontaneous and built on cabeceo. The truth is that it's complicated and it's really not going away. So what do taxi dancers really mean for tango? Are they filling the gap or changing tango culture altogether? Let's banter about it. Hey, welcome back to the Tango Banter. I am Elizaveta. Anytime I bring up the topic of taxi dancers, it always sparks a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. There's a lot of emotions for people when they really start sharing their views about this. So the other day, I posted this as a poll question inside my private Facebook group, which you are welcome to join if you're not already a member. The link is in the show notes. And every week inside that group, I post a discussion poll. So this time, I asked the community what they felt about taxi dancers. And it was interesting to see the division among the community, with certain people saying that they tried it and they really enjoy it, and others saying that they're kind of curious, they've seen it, but they're not so sure about it. But really, the majority of people said they're against it because it tends to change the culture of the social dance. It interferes with the natural flow of the milonga. So what do you think? Have you encountered taxi dancers in your community? Do you feel that they add something to the vibe, or do they take away? As I banter about this today, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. So pop those into the comments. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to me directly on social at I'm So Tango. That's IMSO Tango. So let's talk about first what taxi dancing really is in tango. It's not a new concept. It's been around for quite some time, but it's definitely something hidden in plain sight. And if you don't know what to look for, you might not realize what's happening. This was the case for me when I first was introduced to the idea. I was in Buenos Aires, and one of my friends actually did it for a living. So he was very hush-hush about it. He didn't really explain right away what's happening, but over time that I was hanging out with him, I saw the structure of it, where someone, usually a foreigner, would hire a professional dancer to accompany them to the milonga, either for a period of hours, for like a night, or it might be for a portion of that night. And it was sort of a strange concept to experience firsthand, because I was at a place where I was trying to climb up the social ladder and earn my stripes and to get to dance with some of these professional dancers, higher level dancers. But then I was seeing certain dancers who were not of the same technical level, did not maybe look the part, and they were the ones dancing with these professional dancers. And so in my naive mind, I couldn't make sense of why that was happening. And eventually I realized, oh, it's because they're actually working. This is a taxi dancing situation. Now, I've never actually hired a taxi dancer because I've never felt that to be a necessity, but I've talked to lots of people who have used taxi dancers in the past and have raved about the experience. In particular, once again, when we're talking about Buenos Aires, taxi dancers play a really important role. Like I said, for some of these foreigners who are coming in, if you are not meeting specific criteria to get dances through cabeceo, it would be really sad for people like that not to be able to dance. So taxi dancing is sort of can be seen as a bridge for certain dancers coming in on the scene. And there are teachers who take groups to Buenos Aires, and right off the bat, they actually hire professional dancers to accompany the students to the milonga and serve in that capacity as a taxi dancer for the night. In that context, taxi dancers can be seen as almost ambassadors for tango, representing the culture, allowing people to have access to high quality dance. Those people perhaps might not have access to it otherwise. So it's an important role that they play in the ecosystem of tango. Now, in the last couple of decades, the taxi dancing concept seems to have proliferated out of Buenos Aires and more into the communities and the world of tango at large. So there's been different degrees of this idea evolving in different places. And my experience recently with taxi dancing has been at big festivals where I see more and more that festivals provide taxi dancing as a service. And this is a way for, once again, dancers to have access to high quality dancing, as well as professional tango dancers to have a way of making money, which of course, is an important aspect of tango economy. Now, whereas in Buenos Aires, I was mostly seeing it as the taxi dancers showing up with their clients and dancing with them at the milonga. In festivals in the US that I have attended where taxi dancers were present, the model was more obvious. It was more in your face, meaning that there's a table set up with taxi dancers marked in some way where you knew that they were available to be hired. And then there's a clipboard and somebody signing you up, or there's a token system at some of the festivals where you buy a token and then you use the token to purchase tandas with certain taxi dancers. So in terms of the accessibility of these taxi dancers, it makes it really fun for a lot of dancers. And I'll just say women in particular. I think maybe in Buenos Aires, you would see more of a split between men and women hiring taxi dancers. But I would say, on the whole, the women are the ones who are hiring male taxi dancers. It's not as common for it to be the other way around, although it still does happen. So we know that tango has a huge gender imbalance issue. I think every social dance form actually has this issue, but in tango, it's a bit more dramatic. And the complaints from a lot of the women who are not getting the dances that they want emphasize the need for something like that. So when I was attending one of these festivals where you could buy a token and the tandas cost $5, which is kind of crazy how inexpensive it is for us when we travel. So you could pay $5 and get a tanda with one of the taxi dancers. And the happiness level in the room was definitely pronounced for a lot of the women. I don't think I had ever seen so many women smiling and happy and just having the time of their lives. And it created a little bit of a frenzy because certain dancers were more popular than others. And so there would be a line after every tanda would end, there would be a line that formed to hire the next taxi dancer. And some women would hire the same taxi dancer over and over again, just because it's cheap and it's available. So the vibe in the room was very distinct, and I appreciated seeing how happy it made a lot of the women who would typically not have access to dancers of that level. Now, $5 is a special case. That's pretty inexpensive for our standards. A more typical rate that I have seen is more like 15 to 50, depending on who it is. I have seen certain taxi dancers actually charge more, as much as $50 or $60 a tanda, depending on their reputation or I guess their level that they consider themselves at. So it's quite a range, and it's astounding to think that somebody might pay that much money for a tanda, but that is the case for some people, and it really does work to create a more balanced situation where those who might not have access to these higher level dancers do through the act of just paying for their time. Now, the paid model for taxi dancers is not necessarily the only model that I've seen. And there are festivals who do have taxi dancers who are not necessarily paid, but they serve more in the capacity of an ambassador. So there are people who are not necessarily the highest level dancers, but they are committed to community building and they want to contribute. So they usually will volunteer their time to help balance the roles and dance with people who might not be getting the dances that they want. And it seems that model is very much in the spirit of tango, and everybody loves that. The fact that somebody might choose to give their time to someone and bridge that gap is a great act of service. And of course, when there's no money involved, the consensus is it's much easier for people to deal with the idea of taxi dancing as long as there's no money involved. But the moment that there is money, that's when a bit of that strange energy starts coming up, where it's not so comfortable for us to digest what this means, why some people pay for tandas and others don't. Now, I have evolved in my opinion about taxi dancing over time, just from observing how it's done in different locations and different contexts. And it seems to me, no matter how it's done, discretion matters. I think that the closer the process is to the natural, I'll say natural, the more common way of interacting in the milonga, the better. So the less it stands out, the more seamlessly it kind of blends into the environment. It's nice when the whole process is elegant and allows for a level of intimacy throughout this exchange, meaning that instead of having it be very public, that somebody is purchasing a tanda, it looks much more classy when it's just done behind the scenes, let's say, and you don't really know when somebody's dancing with someone as a taxi dancer. That's been my opinion. I feel like even though a cheap $5 tanda with a taxi dancer is a great deal, there is a little bit of hesitation in me to go along with this whole commercial look of the transaction in the context of a milonga. I don't know. What do you think? I'm curious if you have had experiences where you've seen taxi dancing in action, and whether you think it's something that disturbs the energy of the milonga or doesn't bother it. So let me know in the comments what you think. Now, of course, there is a dark side to the world of taxi dancing. And even though taxi dancers fill a very important role in the ecosystem of tango, there's also some negative consequences of some of this tango dancing culture that's developed over the last, I would say, 10 years or so. When I mentioned that room full of really happy women who were getting all these tandas for $5 a piece, I also noticed in that same room that there was a lot of bitterness from other women who didn't want to pay, who don't like the feeling of having to pay for tango. And so what happened was that the extra happiness that I saw on the faces of some of the women was reflected in the extra bitterness that I saw in some of the others. So even though it's such a necessary element that can be very helpful, it can also create division inside the milonga. It isolates certain people. It makes it a bit less of an organic vibe and more kind of an artificial construct. There's some problems that can develop from this culture, and particularly some dancers have reported in their communities, taxi dancing has become the dominant way that women get dances, that it's expected that when you go out to a milonga, you automatically will be hiring a taxi dancer. In some milongas, there are taxi dancers assigned to a specific table, and you would basically pay for the night to dance with this taxi dancer who would sit with you at the table. Sometimes there's this stratification that happens inside the milonga that you might not even be aware of. And I actually like that I'm not aware of it. There's a milonga that I went to for a long time that had this as part of its model, its business model, where there were a lot of taxi dancers coming in with clients who are ballroom dancers. So a ballroom dancer sometimes who comes in on the tango scene, and it's usually an older woman who doesn't necessarily want to jump through the hoops of cabeceo game and learning the social etiquette and the tricks. Like, you know, for some people, they just don't want to waste their time on that. And so what they'll do instead is they'll just hire a taxi dancer and they dance with them. Now, for a lot of those women, for them, the tango that they think they should be dancing or they want to be dancing is basically moves, big moves that they see on stage that to them represent tango. So what you end up having is a lot of dancers on the dance floor who are dancing with taxi dancers, and they are dancing moves that they don't really know. They're just executing figures that are fancy. And this is where this friction starts happening, where in the same milonga, you might have two very different groups dancing side by side, but not really interacting. Because the culture of taxi dancing sometimes ensures that the women who come in with taxi dancers only dance with the taxi dancers. The incentive a lot of times for the taxi dancers to keep women dancing with them rather than connect with the community. And I think that's where, for most people, that kind of tension feels that it goes against the spirit of social tango, where the whole point is connection and meeting new people and going through the process of that mystery of dancing with strangers. And to think that somebody's coming into the scene and they're not even interested in that. They'd rather just pay and have their tandas with one dancer, one professional dancer, and then that's it. That seems problematic, of course, for us social dancers. At its worst, I've heard of cases where taxi dancers are dancers from other countries who are coming in to the United States, for example, to make money. And they are typically good looking, they have good technique, and they end up forming relationships with women who are novices from ballroom or just who want to have access to that level of dance. And they end up isolating them and kind of creating a more toxic bond where they discourage women from developing any sort of social connection or accepting cabeceo from strangers. They discourage them from being autonomous and instead They're incentivized to keep the relationship going and keep the women more dependent on them. This is, of course, not all taxi dancers, and I don't want to make it sound like taxi dancing is by virtue sinister like that. But just to clarify that it's a spectrum, you can have quite a few versions of what this kind of dynamic can look like. Sometimes it can be as benign as an ambassador at a festival who doesn't take any money. And in that capacity, it's seen as a really nice thing to have. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you can have this very toxic expression of this concept where dancers are being taken advantage of because of financial gain. Now, why does this even exist? Why do we have taxi dancers? And I'm sure for many people, the obvious reason is the gender imbalance. But beyond that, the gender imbalance is itself a symptom of a larger issue, larger set of issues in tango, I would say, with the harder learning curve for leaders in general, and leaders don't stick around. And advanced dancers, advanced leaders, a lot of times become pretty jaded, and they don't necessarily need to work very hard. They have their pick when it comes to partners at the milonga, and they become very selective. Some of them, of course, end up monetizing their talents so they can actually make money off of it. So those aspects of tango are not going to change very quickly. There's no reason for them to change. And when leaders are prompted to dance with more women just as a way of making it better for everyone else, it doesn't seem to go very far. You know, ultimately, there's got to be an incentive. The goodwill of some leaders can only go so far before it has to become something that's gratifying in some way, meaning that they need to really enjoy dancing with somebody, or they need to have some sort of other compensation, something that makes it worthwhile. And a lot of times the monetary aspect is what makes it more worthwhile for them to dance with certain dancers, as much as it is uncomfortable to admit to it. So taxi dancing is not going anywhere. If anything, it's going to continue to grow and evolve. Now, there is a parallel trend that's going on right now that also addresses the issue of gender imbalance. We started this banter talking about that the whole point of taxi dancing is to fill that gap, to balance the gender roles at events and to create more symmetry in that way. But the other very big trend that is going on that you also can participate in is women leading. And the more women are open to the idea of leading themselves or accepting cabeceo from other women, it can be another way of dealing with this imbalance that gives us a bit more choice. Ultimately, to me, taxi dancing is not that big of a deal until it becomes sort of the only option, which puts someone in a position of perhaps being exploited or being taken advantage of. I like it to be an option for someone, but I also think that it just needs to be an option. It doesn't need to be the main way that somebody gets to dance. There are instances of women paying for taxi dancers, not just to dance with them at a milonga, but certain women, because they are followers and because of the gender imbalance, they have to pay a taxi dancer to join them for the whole event. And they pay not only for their time, but also for the attendance fee for their partner. So thinking about the amount of money that somebody is willing to pay for a dance for the privilege of having a tanda that they like, the demand is high. It just points to how important, how fulfilling this thing is, how much we are ready to give in exchange for a beautiful tanda. So there's a rising number of women leaders, and in general, female leaders tend to be less picky, less judgmental, because we all know what it's like. So there's a bit more generosity from female leaders, at least from what I have observed. I know for some women, it's about the energy of the man, of being able to dance with a man. So that's an important aspect to honor. And I'm not saying that that should be overlooked or forgotten, but also know consciously that you have a choice. That yes, you have access to taxi dancing, but you also have access to dancing with female leaders. And if dancing is your priority and not waiting, not sitting around, then this is a very valid way of pursuing dance and learning to connect with other types of leaders, not just the ones who are male. Now, I've been asked a couple of times whether I would be open to taxi dancing. And it was an interesting question to ponder, because my knee-jerk reaction was no. But I had to think about why. Because it wasn't that I necessarily disagree with the practice, but for me, I keep coming back to that as a dancer, the milonga space is my time. It's my sacred time to dance, and I don't like to work when I'm at a milonga. Sometimes I DJ, and that is work, but that's about as far as I go. So I'm curious where you're at with it. If you were offered to taxi dance, would you do it? Pop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Now, when it comes to unsolicited feedback on the dance floor, perhaps in the middle of a tanda, have you ever had that happen to you? What did that feel like? What do you do with that? How do you respond? Let's banter about it next week. Until then, ciao.